Vishakha and Others versus State of Rajasthan 1997 is a landmark case in the area of women's rights and sexual harassment at workplace. Before this landmark judgment, there was no legislative framework that provided for offences related to the sexual harassment of women at workplace. The case began with the unfortunate incident of Bhavri Devi, a social worker of Rajasthan who had gone to stop a child marriage but was eventually gang raped. The incident and enquiry which followed unveiled tremendous loopholes regarding the protection of women's rights under the Indian Constitution. The Supreme Court, in its ruling, laid down the Vishakha guidelines. It prescribed procedures to be followed by the employers for the prevention and redressal of acts of sexual harassment against women in the workplace. This case illustrates a relationship between various procedures of domestic laws and international treaties such as CEDAW. CEDAW stands for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Youth. The judgment in this case enforced the argument that in the case of silence of domestic laws, the judiciary is justified in using international treaties to look at the infringement of fundamental rights. Bhavri Devi was a social worker from Bhateri, Rajasthan. She was working under a government-initiated women's development project. It was primarily the child marriage and other similar activities that she had to campaign against in her locality. In 1992, one Ram Karan Gujjar's family had made a marriage arrangement for their baby child. Bhavri Devi tried to prevent this child marriage. This resulted in Ram Karan Gujjar's family being humiliated, ostracized, and financially drained. On September 22, 1992, a group of 5 men ferociously gang raped her, a punishment for her efforts. The brutal act was followed by complacent callousness by both the local authorities, the local police, and the doctors towards the survivor. Medical examination was delayed by 50 hours, and even after the examination, a very important aspect of the incident was omitted from the medical report. Even though the incident was extremely serious, the trial court acquitted the accused due to the lack of evidence or the so-called procedural technicalities. The verdict of the trial court was perceived as a miscarriage of justice. Many women's rights groups took collective action and filed a public interest litigation under Article 32 of the Constitution. The case came up for hearing in the Supreme Court. Chief Justice J.S. Verma constituted a 3-judge constitutional bench comprising Chief Justice J.S. Verma, Justice Sujata V. Manohar, and Justice B.N. Kirpal. The following 4 issues were raised. Issue number 1 was whether acquittal of the accused and the non-providing of a safe working environment for women resulted in the violation of their fundamental rights under Article 14, 15, 19, 1 and 21 of the Constitution. Issue number 2 was whether in the absence of any statutory provisions on the subject of sexual harassment in the work environment, could the judiciary lay down any guidelines binding in nature to protect the rights of the women. Issue number 3 was whether an employer had inbuilt responsibilities as at a very minimum to provide maintenance of a safe working environment. Issue number 4 was in the absence of any local enactment, whether the court could take the help of international treaties and norms primarily on the subject of women's rights as an aid to interpret and enforce the fundamental rights. Now we come to the arguments. The arguments by the petitioners. The following were the main points of arguments by the women's rights groups and the NGO herein the name of Vishakha in the PIL filed. Number 1, that all the instances of sexual harassment, such as Bhavi Devi's case, can directly infringe upon women's rights to equality under Article 14, right to life with dignity and security, Article 21, and right to practice any profession or to carry out any occupation, trade, or business under Article 19(1)(g). The petitioners also argued that the absence of any protective legislation left the women solely vulnerable and without any effective mechanisms to redress to. As a second argument, the petitioners prayed for specific guidelines for the authors of the Criminal Procedure Code, the Indian Penal Code, and evidence in order to fulfill the legislative void and act as an interim arrangement till the enactment of specific law. The third argument, which was pushed forward by the petitioners, was that since India is a signatory to CEDAW, thereby committing itself to preserve the women's rights, such perspectives must also avail to Indian women under the domestic provisions. The argument which was made was that the constitutional guarantees must be interpreted in the light of international norms, thereby ensuring that such victims would gain adequate protection and redress. Now we come to the arguments by the respondents. The respondents were represented by the Solicitor General and sought to support the petitioners' cries for judicial intervention. The respondents stated that in the absence of any recognition by the legislation, such an act should be remitted by Article 32 judicially. They agreed with the petitioners on the establishment of a guideline by which an immediate safe environment for women could be assured while the law reforms were under process. The respondents argued that the employers have legal and moral responsibility to maintain a safe working environment. They argued that state must require mechanisms to advertise and create redressal committees to provide monitoring, prevention, and prompt action in the case of complaints with regard to sexual harassment. The respondents also said that bringing India in alignment with the international best practices would be relevant. The ratio decidendi of Vishakha judgment provides critical principles of law on a number of grounds. The court held that sexual harassment constitutes a violation of fundamental rights as guaranteed by Article 14, 15, 19, 1G and 21 of the Constitution. Sexual harassment infringes on a woman's dignity while at work and denies her the right to live in honor. In the absence of statutory provisions on the subject, the Supreme Court claimed to be able to frame guidelines during the exercise of its inherent powers under Article 32 so as to form a proper and effective protection for women against sexual harassment. These came up for Vishakha guidelines. Such judicial activism was viewed as both mandatory as well as necessary for the protection of the vulnerable group. This case thrived on the principle that an employer is legally bound to take positive precautionary steps to prevent the commission of sexual harassment. Some of the preventive measures are establishing complaint redressal mechanisms, providing safe and secure workplace, and taking disciplinary action against the offenders. The court suggested these with the object of holding the employer liable for preventive as well as remedial measures. The court held that international conventions and treaties which are signatory for India, like those of women's rights such as CEDAW, could be incorporated in the Indian domestic law for even more protection. They may be read as compatible with the Indian Constitution as well as being essential for the interpretation and application of fundamental guarantee it affords in a modern globalized context. Now we come to the judgment. The Vishakha judgment marked a glorious legal milestone in the history of sexual harassment at workplace. The court outlined a definition of sexual harassment which was very wide and extensive. This was a major break from the earlier definitions, which were narrow and frequently excluded from the coverage of acts that were practically considered harassment. Sexual harassment constitutes a breach of fundamental rights guaranteed to a woman. The court's logic is firmly rooted in equality and human dignity. The court declared that until the parliament enacted a comprehensive law, the Vishakha guidelines laid down by it would be binding to all the employers, whether in public services or private. It laid down certain clear procedural requirements concerning the prevention of sexual harassment, the setup of complaints committee, time-bound redressal mechanisms, and mandatory awareness program. The Supreme Court used international conventions such as supplementary sources for domestic law. By relying upon the provisions of international committees and conventions such as CEDAW, the court once again upheld its commitment to gender justice while at the same time ensuring conformity of its rulings with the international human rights standards. The Vishakha guideline was eventually replaced by the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Protection and Redressal Act 2013. Hi, I am Vishwajit and you are watching Landmark Cases.